Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics like wealth creation strategies, investment principles, creating passive income, paying off your debt faster, and much, much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Bills, we're back again with the number one most listened to podcast in the Sahara Desert. You think I'm wrong? Prove it.
I'd love to know where you're getting those stats from, Andrew, but you know what? Let's go with it, right?
Absolutely. Why not? Why not?
There we go. So coming live from the Sahara Desert.
Exactly right.
is our podcast. And look, this week what we're going to talk about, and we have been having conversations with people about this, and it's becoming more and more difficult, and it's a larger and larger focus of what we're doing for people and talking to people about. It's essentially the mortgages, and we're going to go through some practical tips that people can consider to get on top of or to manage increasing interest rates.
Yeah.
So some of them are really practical, some of them may not be, but we thought, hey, how can we get as much value across as possible? Because from our conversations and from what we can see, people are really starting to feel a pinch with 10 interest rate increases in 10 months. Plus you've got increasing cost of living with inflation as well too.
Yeah. Well, we did get one break in interest rate increases, only because the RBA doesn't meet in January. They didn't have a choice.
I was scratching my head there for a sec, Andrew, going, hang on a sec, I don't think I've made a mistake here. But
No, you haven't made a mistake. They've done 10 months consecutively in months that they could increase rates. There was 1 month that they couldn't, but that's only because they don't meet in January.
So you've got me on a technicality, well done.
Right.
But look,
the outcome... bring some lightheartedness to this overly morbid topic.
Before we get into the serious stuff here and start actually talking about some of the things. But yeah, you're right. No, it's a serious topic. And the whole idea of this is to try and get some ideas out there in terms of the things that we think about when we're talking to people about it. How do we go about managing this to try and offset and alleviate some of the pain and the cash flow pressure that people and households are experiencing? Andrew, take us away.
Look, first one, which I guess should kind of always be the first step, is exploring the options with your existing lender. I mean, you really want to sit down, you really want to have a look at, all right, what's the interest rate that I'm paying? Where's it at, in terms of the market? Am I overpaying from an interest rate perspective? Can I sit down with my existing lender, not have to, reset loan terms, go through the refinance process, go through all of that? Can I just negotiate my interest rate? Now, whether you do that on your own, whether you do that with the help of your mortgage broker, making sure that you've got the most competitive rate at any given time is really going to help alleviate some of the pressure. And if you can wind back, one or two of the interest rate rises that the RBA's done by just negotiating with your existing provider, then that's only going to make the cash flow burden a little bit lighter.
Yeah, and I guess the key takeout, because that's essentially when we're talking to people, that's the first thing that we do. If you never ask, you're never going to know. I think that's the first thing. And it may seem like a fairly daunting task, and people kind of put this obstacle in front of them going, oh, they're never going to do that. But I think asking the question, and especially if you know what to ask and how to ask it, and we'll cover that now, it's not that daunting. And the worst thing that they can say is no. Yeah. So you've really got nothing to lose other than probably just the amount of time that you have to wait on hold. But realistically, when you do this, I think the easiest thing to do is just make sure that get your numbers right. So what I mean by that is make sure that you know what interest rate that you're paying. And if you've got something to compare it to, so you can say, hey, it's not the most competitive in the market because, the bank down the road are charging whatever the rate is, at least you've got some sort of case to put to them that shows that you've done your homework.
Yeah. And when you're comparing it, you want to compare like for like. Yeah? So
absolutely.
You're going to want to show the lender that, hey, this bank down the road is offering principal and interest, 80% loan to value ratio for an owner-occupied property.
Yep.
You don't want to conflate owner-occupied versus investment or anything like that. But compare like for like, find an alternative option that's cheaper or significantly cheaper, and use that as a leveraging or bargaining tool to say, look, if you can't match it, or if you can't do it, then that's fine. I'll just start the refinance process.
Yeah, yep. Which takes us into the next one. But before we even get into that, probably just on that last point with the existing lender, if you're in a really tight jam where you're getting to the stage where you're thinking that you may not be able to make your repayments, I think it's best in this instance that you consider being honest with the lender and talking to them about that as well. Because in that event, actually all of the lenders, I should say, they have hardship programs that they put people in.
Yep.
And most of the time, it looks like a 3-month repayment holiday. So that could be just enough breathing space to be able to allow you to restructure things or get some professional advice or talk to somebody, just to give you enough time to reorganise things to figure out what you're going to do.
Yep.
And not necessarily saying that that's the, you go straight to that. Hopefully you're not in that position, or you haven't, if you're heading towards that position, you haven't left it too late where that's where you're at. But if it is, that's also an option as well too. And I'd say all the banks are working with clients who are in that position to try and help them navigate through it.
Yeah, well, it doesn't serve in their interest for you to miss a repayment or anything like that. You do want to make sure, if you are going to go down that route, should kind of be a last resort.
Yeah.
It is going to have an impact on your credit history. It is going to have an impact on your ability to borrow in the future. So you want to make sure that if you're doing that, and if you're going through that process, that you've received advice, you know that this is a last resort, and you know that this is something that that you're going to undertake for a short period of time. It's not going to solve it. It's not going to give you an answer. But what it is going to do is give you a bit of breathing space to be able to work out another solution. So make sure that you're fully aware of what the implications are if you are going to go down that route as well.
Leading into our second suggestion, our second tip, is the refinancing process. So whether that's with your existing lender or whether it's with a new lender, I think considering refinancing is a smart thing to do. The thing that we need to be mindful of here is probably two things that spring to mind. The first thing from my perspective, and I've spoken about it a fair bit, is resetting the loan term. So in an instance where the repayments are getting too high, resetting the loan term will help you ordinarily. Plus, if you get a cheaper interest rate or a more competitive interest rate, it's going to help you as well. In saying that, you need to be mindful, and you need to be aware that if you are resetting the term, you're going back to a standard 30 years most of the time. So it's not like you'll pay off your house in the original 30 years unless you do something with your repayments, but you're doing this exercise because cash flow is probably becoming an issue. That's probably the first thing. And then the second thing, Andrew, is that you need to be mindful that if you are above 80% loan to value ratio, you'll be paying mortgage insurance again.
Yeah, exactly right. Unless you're in, certain occupations, doctors, lawyers, or anything above a certain income, you can, or there are certain lenders that will waiver the mortgage insurance in those instances. But generally speaking, if your loan to value ratio is above 90%, you are paying mortgage insurance, which
80%?
Above 80%.
Yep.
So it does make things a little bit more challenging, because that option is off the table if your LVR's at 90%, and so it does mean that the banks to some degree kind of have you locked in, and so you're. I don't want to say that they've got you locked in, but realistically they know that they've got you in a position whereby the implications of you refinancing are much larger than just resetting the loan term or going through a different interest rate. So perhaps negotiating power is a little bit more difficult if you're in that instance with your existing lender, but yeah, absolutely. Refinancing, if you're not, above that 80% LVR, gives you an opportunity to go for a lower interest rate. Long term, you also want to make sure that, if you are resetting the loan term, you want to make additional repayments to pay off that debt quicker. But in this instance, we're talking about, immediate cash flow issue. We're talking about immediate pressure on cash flow. So resetting the loan term might be the thing that does, help spread out those repayments and help alleviate some of that cash flow pressure that you might be feeling.
Yeah, and look, I guess it's a trade-off with, not that you'd want to pay lenders mortgage insurance. Obviously, some property markets have experienced a deduction or a reduction in terms of the houses that are in there. So if it's a toss-up between still being able to afford your mortgage repayments versus being able to refinance to a cheaper rate, resetting the loan term to 30 years, and paying a bit of mortgage insurance that probably gets capitalised onto the loan. In the right set of circumstances, or in the wrong set of circumstances, depending on which way you look at it, it could be a worthwhile defensive strategy to buy you more breathing space, which is essentially what we're talking about here. Yeah. Once again, I'd say in a situation like that, if that's something that you are considering, you definitely need to get advice on that. You need to be talking to someone. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think that's the big key in everything that we're doing here is you're not solving the problem.
Yep.
Like the really big thing that you really need to solve for is there's a cash flow hole, there's a budget, there's a hole in the budget. Everything that we're talking about here is buying you breathing space, is buying you the ability to, take a little bit of extra time in order to be able to sort out your circumstances, but you still are going to need to solve for the issue at some point in time. So at some point in time, you're either going to need to reduce your debt, you're going to need to earn a higher income, you're going to need to reduce expenses, you're going to need to do something. This is just buying you the space and the breathing space to be able to, facilitate a change of direction.
Absolutely. Number 3, converting the loan from principal and interest to interest only.
Yeah, that's another option. Now, you look at Billy and I, and we're not overly comfortable with a strategy like this. You really want
ordinarily
speaking, you wouldn't be going into something like this lightly. You'd really want to make sure that you're paying down your debts, that you're reducing the amount of debt that you're holding. So most of our recommendations to clients is make principal and interest repayments. But again, if you're trying to buy some breathing space, if you're trying to buy some space to be able to, sort something out longer term, that's definitely another option, whether it's, converting your existing loan with your existing lender to interest only, or whether that's converting or refinancing and moving across to interest only. That's another option as well.
Yeah, and this one's probably a little bit trickier from a lender perspective as well too. From a serviceability point of view, you need to be able to justify that you can afford it. And the other thing too, if it's on an owner-occupier, banks in general don't like to see interest-only repayments on an owner-occupier. On an investment property, because of the tax deductibility element of investment debt, they understand that, so it makes sense if you could put your principal repayments to non-deductible. So it does get a little bit more challenging, and you probably need a broker in order to help you navigate through that, just so you make sure that you're presenting it correctly to the lender. But this one will be a little bit trickier, albeit in saying that if you can convert from principal and interest to interest only, from a cash flow perspective, even temporarily, it can save a fair large amount, depending on how long you've had the loan for, but it can save a large amount when you look at your principal repayments in terms of your loan component and your repayment component each and every month.
Yeah.
So worthwhile strategy in the right instance, but a little bit more complicated. And yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Andrew. It's not our first choice, but once again, you've got to, in situations where people are experiencing some pressure with cash flow, and especially when it comes to mortgages and debt and their owner-occupier, I think everything should be on the table.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yep.
Other thing to note on that is a lot of the times, if you are going to go down the route of converting over to interest only, you want to make sure that you're also comparing the interest rate is generally higher. So if you're moving on to an interest only, you're paying a higher interest rate, but you're not making principal repayments.
Yes.
So have a look at, okay, what's the impact from a cash flow perspective? Am I paying a higher interest rate, and that's just basically eating into the majority, if not all, of the savings from moving over from principal and interest to interest only? Am I better off making principal and interest repayments and having a cheaper interest rate? Look at the repayments at the end of it, work out a cost-benefit analysis, and actually ascertain whether it's the right thing to do, rather than moving, full steam ahead into that.
Yep. Andrew, number 4.
Yes, number 4. If you've got money available in redraw, that's another means that you can pull money out of in order to be able to continue to make repayments. So if you've made additional repayments in the past, if you've paid down the loan further in the past, making repayments or drawing money out from that redraw facility is another way to utilize that for future repayments.
Yeah, and just on that note, once again, similar to the last point that we were talking about, that will depend on lender,
Yep.
lender to lender, and policy to policy. because they've all got different approaches and different thoughts around this stuff. So once again, I reckon if you're going to consider that as an option, if you were making additional repayments in the past and you've got a bit of redraw there and you want to use your redraw in order to cover a few payments, I would definitely suggest speaking to at least a mortgage broker and getting some advice before you make that approach, just because your broker will be able to help you out in terms of how to approach that.
Yeah. Similar vein. Now, it's not the same, right? Because it's also a very, very different thing. But similar vein to that and drawing money out of redraw is drawing money out from other investments. You might have another investment portfolio. You might have another, thing that sits alongside your wealth creation strategy. I would first, pause contributions to it. So not making any future contributions before you actually draw money out. That can help alleviate some of the cash flow pressure. But if you've already done that, if you're already at the stage where you're not making contributions towards your investments, you've got an investment that you can draw out of, then that's another option to be able to make or buy some time from a cash flow side of things, which is another reason why we're big proponents on holding multiple assets, holding multiple investment vehicles, because it gives you the options in difficult times to be able to draw down on it if you need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Number 5, it sounds really obvious. Maybe it's the type of market that you shouldn't be considering this, but once again, having everything on the table, you can always sell the property.
Yep.
And I don't mean to sound flippant about that and just sell the property, because it could be somebody's owner-occupier. But in the example, or in the scenario where you've done all that you can, you're really hard-pressed, you're not sure how you're going to make your next repayment, that has to be a viable option. Because the truth is, if that's not the case, then, and you do miss a couple of repayments, then the bank are going to sell it for you eventually anyway, and you definitely don't want that to happen. So it's potentially seeing the writing on the wall and then saying, hey, you know what, I need to sell it in order to exit this position. It's a difficult one to think about, difficult one to stomach, but it's definitely one that we should talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, at any point in time, things shift, things change, and if you need to adjust your position, then you need to adjust your position. Selling the property is definitely another means to be able to, obviously help alleviate that burden. Potentially, maybe not as extreme of an example, and maybe a bit of a bridge between both. Consider moving in with family, renting the property out, or even if that's not an option, renting out a cheaper property. I know it's a little bit more difficult in this environment, given that rental prices have kind of gone through the roof across Australia. But consider renting your existing property out that you're living in and moving into a property where the rent's a little bit cheaper as well.
Yeah. No, well said. And probably the last one from my perspective is, you've made that decision to do all you can do, you write it out, which I think is what a lot of people are doing.
Yeah.
If we're realistic, I think a lot of people are doing that. They're just making the decision that, no matter what it is, we're just going to write it out.
Yeah, exactly right. And look, I think what we're considering here is things that you can do in your financial structure in order to be able to alleviate the cash flow burden of rising interest rates. Now, naturally, it should be a combination of both, right? Like, there's going to be a change that you make to the structure of your finances, but at the same time, there's also going to be a lifestyle change that's also going to need to happen as well. You shouldn't be, you can, but you shouldn't be going through, any of these things if you're not at the same time or prior to that making a lifestyle change or a lifestyle adjustment as well. That being said, you're not going to sit at home 7 days a week, eat 2-minute noodles and not go out or enjoy your life at all. So you need to strike a balance between both a lifestyle shift as well as a structure around your finance shift as well.
Yeah, and I think that's happening just because of inflation anyway.
Yeah.
And then you go and couple it with increasing interest rates. I think everybody that I've been talking to, that's been happening naturally anyway. Yeah. Absolutely. Andrew, I think that's so to recap those sort of 6 that we came up with. So explore the options with existing lender.
Yep.
Seems to be number 1. Number 2 is the refinancing approach, either with the existing lender or with a new lender. At that particular point in time, potentially looking at resetting the loan term as well too. So you'll get kind of a double whammy, hopefully a lower interest rate and being able to reset the loan term. Number 3 was considering interest only. If you are on a principal and interest loan, converting it across to interest only. There was the redraw option as number 4, if you've got redraw and if your lender allows you to do that. On the more extreme end, number 5 was selling the property. And then number 6 was if you're in a position to be able to write it out, and that's the decision that you make, write it out.
Yeah, and look, I think it's the solace that people should take is this isn't something that, only a few people are experiencing. It's being experienced by, I dare say the majority of people in Australia, whether it's from inflation or whether it's from a rising interest rate. If you are struggling with this, if you do feel the need for, financial advice and really need some help in this area, we've got a few different strategies and a few different ways that we can work with clients to, help them and help facilitate the cash flow burden that they might be experiencing. So please, our details are in the show notes. Feel free to reach out and get in contact.
Well said, Andrew. And to our listeners and our viewers, I hope you got a fair bit out of that. Like Andrew said, if you want to chat about your situation, feel free to reach out. We're always here. Details are in the show notes, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we've talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and it is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amiridis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Pty Ltd, authorized representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.